That morning in San Liberty, the whole town gathered in front of the old courthouse like it was a holiday nobody wanted. The street was already dust-colored, the kind of dust that finds its way into your boots and stays there as long as you do. Folk stood shoulder to shoulder, traders with clean cuffs, ranch owners with polished spurs, and men who looked like they'd slept in their saddles more nights than in beds. I was 15 then, a stable boy from the livery, and I slipped out just to see what was pulling everybody into the sun so early. In a frontier town, crowds don't form for nothing. Crowds mean hangings, sermons, or bargains that aren't really bargains. That day, it was an auction. A notice had been nailed to the courthouse board, crooked, like whoever posted it didn't care if it looked proper. It offered a cabin, a well, an old barn, and a stretch of land out west. Not a ranch, not even a good claim. Just scrub and thorn and whatever grass the wind hadn't stolen yet, about a dozen acres, give or take, the kind of place a man buys when he's trying to disappear. The auctioneer, Mr. Pell, stood on the courthouse steps with a ledger tucked under one arm and a gavel in his hand. He kept clearing his throat as if he could cough up courage. Then he announced the starting bid. 12 cents. Not $12, not even $1. 12 cents. About the price of a biscuit and a cup of coffee if the cook liked you. You'd think a laugh would have gone through the crowd. It didn't. Instead, a murmur rolled once, low and uneasy, then everything went quiet. Not the respectful kind of quiet either. This was the kind of silence people make when they've all silently agreed on the same thing. Don't be the one who touches it. I still remember a single copper coin spinning in the dirt by the courthouse steps, somebody flicking it out of nervous habit. It whirred and rattled on its edge like it didn't want to lie down. That sound, thin and stubborn, cut through the stillness better than any voice. Mr. Pell tried again. Do I hear 12 cents? No one moved. The well-fed traders stood like they'd been nailed to the boardwalk. The ranch owners stared straight ahead, faces hard, eyes careful. Even the men who never missed a chance at cheap land kept their hands down. A fly landed on Mr. Pell's knuckle. He didn't even swat it. Then, at the edge of the crowd, one hand rose, slowly like lifting a weight. Gideon Hale. Everyone knew Gideon, even if they didn't claim him. He was the kind of rancher you see around the feed store buying the cheapest grain and pretending it's a strategy. Dust-worn denim, boots repaired too many times, a hat that had lost its shape but not its stucconess. His face looked like weather had taken a personal interest in it, creased, sun-baked, and set in a tired kind of determination. He didn't smile, he didn't look proud. He just spoke in that rough, gravelly way of his. 12 cents. Every head turned. And here's the part that stayed with me. Nobody looked jealous, nobody looked impressed. What filled their eyes was pity, pure and plain, like Gideon had just volunteered to step into a hole everyone else had been carefully walking around. Mr. Pell hesitated as if he was hoping someone, anyone, would save him from finishing the sale. He forced the words out anyway. 12 cents I have. Do I hear anything higher? A long pause, a painful pause. Somewhere behind me I heard a woman whisper, "Don't." But no one did. The gavel came down with a sound like a coffin nail. Sold, Mr. Pell said too quickly, relief and dread battling across his face, to Mr. Gideon Hale. Gideon nodded once, accepted the deed paper like it was a chore, and turned away. The crowd parted for him the way water parts around a rock, quiet, reluctant, and quick to close again. As he walked past, I caught the smell of him, horse sweat, cheap tobacco, and something faintly burned like cold ash in an iron stove. He didn't say a word to anyone. He just went to his horse, swung up, and rode out toward the west road. That road led to a place people rarely named out loud, Crow's Gate. Even the name sounded wrong, like an old joke that no one remembered laughing at. The wind picked up and ran dust through the street. The copper coin by the courthouse steps wobbled once more and settled face up, staring at the sky like it wished it hadn't been brought into this world at all. I stood there longer than I should have, watching the dust trail Gideon left behind. And that's when I noticed something else, a thin, dark drag mark in the dirt leading away from the courthouse steps. It could have been nothing, a crate, a broken wheel, a careless boot. But it looked like something heavy had been pulled. I went back to the livery, but my hands wouldn't steady. I brushed horses too hard, then not hard enough. My uncle watched me for a while, squinting like he could read worry the way some men read tracks. "You see the auction?" he asked. I nodded.
He spat into the straw and said, "Boy, 12 cents ain't a price. It's an invitation." That afternoon, the sun slid lower and turned the river beyond town into a strip of hammered copper. I climbed to the hayloft window and watched the west road the way you watch a storm you can't outrun. Far out, Gideon was a lone rider against the land, shrinking into the distance. And for one moment, just one, through heat haze and drifting dust, I thought I saw something pale near a gatepost out there. A shape that didn't belong. Something hanging, maybe swaying slightly like the wind was testing it. I told myself it was a sheet, or an old sock, or my eyes playing tricks. I told myself a lot of things. Night came. The town quieted in that uneasy way it does when everyone's pretending to sleep. I lay on the hay with my eyes open, listening to coyotes and the restless shifting of horses below. Then, sometime deep in the dark, a single gunshot rolled across the flats from the west. Not the sharp crack of target practice. The other kind. The kind that ends something. I sat up in the hayloft, heart thudding, staring into the darkness beyond the last buildings, toward the road that vanished into Crow's Gate. And I understood, even then, that Gideon Hale hadn't bought a cheap cabin. He bought whatever came with it.
Gideon Hale reached Crow's Gate under a sky the color of old tin, the kind of sky that makes a man feel like the world's holding its breath. The land out there didn't welcome anybody. No friendly shade, no tall, soft grass, just thorn, scrub, and that empty silence you get where the wind has nothing left to talk to. His horse felt it first. The animal kept tossing its head, snorting like it could taste something wrong on the air. Gideon had ridden through storms, through drought, through nights so cold the stars looked sharp enough to cut. But this was different. This was quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. Then the gate came into view. A simple wooden gate, weather gray, half swallowed by tall grass. A crossbeam stretched across the top like the kind of thing folks used to hang lanterns from, or other things if their hearts were dark enough. Something was hanging there. Gideon pulled hard on the reins. The animal stopped so fast its hooves scraped stone. Its ears pinned back. It snorted once, sharp, frightened, and refused to take another step. Gideon slid down from the saddle, boots hitting dirt, and he walked toward the gate with one hand near his knife. The closer he got, the clearer it became that this wasn't a scarecrow. This wasn't some rancher's joke. It was a person. A woman. Patchy by the cut of her cheekbones and the thick black braids that had been hacked uneven, like somebody took a dull blade to them just to be cruel. But what stopped Gideon cold wasn't only who she was, it was her size. She was enormous, taller than most men Gideon had ever met, shoulders broad as a doorframe, arms built like she'd spent her life hauling stone and refusing to complain about it. She didn't look like the kind of person you could hang easily. She looked like the kind of person who'd fight the rope itself. And she was still alive. Her eyes were cracked open just a little, wet with stubborn life. Her chest rose in ragged pulls. The rope dug deep into the skin of her neck, raw and bleeding where it had burned her. Her boots dangled inches from the ground, swaying slightly, the rope creaking with each small movement of wind. Gideon didn't pray. He didn't freeze. He did what he could do. He drew his knife. The blade flashed bright against the dull sky. He cut. The rope snapped apart and her body dropped with real weight, heavy, undeniable. Gideon stepped in to catch her and it nearly took him down. His knees sank into the dirt. For a second it felt like trying to catch a falling fence post. He managed to guide her down more than catch her, and they hit the ground hard together. She lay on the dry grass, breathing in broken bursts, like each breath had to be earned. Gideon tore a strip from his own shirt and wrapped it around her neck, pressing it firm where the rope had chewed her skin. His hands trembled just slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the strange pressure of realizing a life was still there and could still be lost. "Easy," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Stay with me." Her eyes rolled toward him, and for a moment the look in them wasn't weakness, it was fury. A kind of fury that said she'd remember every face that put her there. She tried to speak. The sounds came out broken in a language Gideon didn't know, but the meaning was plain enough. She wanted to live, and she didn't trust anyone who looked like him. Gideon reached for the canteen at his hip and chipped a few drops of water onto her lips.
She swallowed with visible effort. Her breathing steadied a fraction, and Gideon finally allowed himself to look back up at the gate. The crossbeam was stained. Dark smears worked into the wood grain. There were scratches there too, shallow, frantic marks, like someone's nails had clawed at the timber. It didn't look like a random act. It looked staged. A message left out in the open. This is what happens here. Gideon stared at it, jaw tightening. He didn't believe in curses, but he believed in men who made places feel cursed on purpose. He hooked his arms under the woman's shoulders and dragged her toward the cabin beyond the gate. It took everything in him. The grass snagged. His boots slipped. His back complained. But he kept moving. One hard pull at a time. The cabin sat a short distance in, hunched and quiet among scrub oak. Its windows were boarded shut. Not the loose, weathered boards of an abandoned home. These were nailed on tight, clean at the edges, like they'd been hammered in by someone with a plan. The chimney was soot dark, not bleached by years. Even before Gideon stepped inside, he knew the town's rumors were wrong. This place wasn't forgotten. Inside, dustily thick, but not ancient. Cold ash sat in the stove, not broken down into fine powder the way it would after many seasons. A table stood in the center, scarred and worn, and one fresh gouge in the wood caught the light like a pale wound. Gideon laid the woman on the table because the bed looked too small and too weak to hold her. He pulled a blanket from an old trunk and covered her shoulders. The blanket smelled like cedar and old sweat, like someone had used it not so long ago. He worked quietly, checking her bruises, tightening the cloth at her neck, trying to do what little a rancher could do without a doctor. Every time his fingers touched her skin, he felt the tension in her body, pain, pride, and a readiness to fight even half dead. When he stepped back, he studied her face in the dim light. I'd heard stories at trading posts, tales about a giant Apache woman, kin to a chief, fierce enough to scare grown men into whispering. I'd laughed at those stories before. Now the story was breathing in front of him. As the light faded outside, Gideon walked onto the porch and scanned the tree line. And there, far off at the edge of the woods, a rider sat motionless on horseback. A wide-brimmed hat, a silver band that caught the last rays of sun like a knife. The rider didn't approach, didn't wave, didn't leave. He just watched. Gideon held that gaze for a heartbeat, and then the rider turned sharply and vanished into the trees, as if the forest had swallowed him. A cold line ran down Gideon's spine. He went back inside, shut the door, and set a chair under the latch. He pulled his Winchester close and checked it by lantern glow. Not rushed, not trembling, just certain. Behind him, the woman stirred. Her eyes opened again, clearer now. Her throat worked, and one English word scraped out like it had to fight its way free. Danger. Gideon didn't answer with big words. He didn't promise anything. He simply sat there with the rifle across his lap, watching the door, while the night settled around Crow's Gate like a hood being pulled tight.
That night, I didn't sleep the way a boy is supposed to sleep. I lay up in the hayloft above the livery, staring into the dark rafters while the wind worried at the boards and the horses shifted below. Every creak sounded like a footstep. Every distant yip from the coyotes sounded like laughter, like the prairie was amused by whatever Gideon Hale had just bought for 12 cents. I kept telling myself the town was only spooked because folks like being spooked. San Liberty had a talent for it. We could turn a cracked window into a ghost story before supper. Then the wind changed, and from far off to the west, across the flats, I heard a single gunshot. Not close, not loud enough to rattle windows, just one hard report that rolled through the open country and faded slow, like thunder that didn't bother showing its clouds. It wasn't the kind of shot you hear when somebody's hunting rabbits. It was the kind you hear when an argument ends in the only language men like ours trust. I sat up in the hay and listened to the silence that followed. The night didn't give me anything else. No second shot, no scream, just the wind and my own heart banging like it wanted out. By morning, the whole town felt wrong. People moved, but they moved carefully, like the air might break if they stepped too hard. Gossip ran through Sim Liberty faster than any horse. It slipped under doors, climbed port steps, and settled into the general store by breakfast. A ranch hand swore he'd seen a stranger ride in after midnight, heading toward the saloon owner's back room. A laundress claimed she'd washed shirts that smelled like smoke and pine pitch. Somebody else said they'd heard talk of the gate in the papers, and then suddenly remembered they didn't want to keep talking. I did chores with my ears open and my hands pretending not to shake. That was my talent, being small enough that adults spoke like I was part of the furniture. Near mid-morning, Gideon rode back into San Liberty. I saw him first from the livery door. His horse came in lathered and jumpy, eyes rolling a little too white at the edges. And Gideon looked like he'd aged a whole season in one night. Dust clung to his cheekbones. There was dried blood along his knuckles. His face had that hard, calm men get after they've seen something they can't afford to process yet. He tied off at the hitching rail and walked straight to the general store like he'd been invited there by necessity, not choice. I followed at a distance, slow and careful, pretending I was just heading that way anyhow. The closer I got, the quieter things became. It was like the store itself decided to hold its breath. Inside, Gideon set a few coins on the counter. "I need bandages," he said. "Carbolic if you've got it. Clean cloth, food that won't spoil mean on the right back." Mr. Sloan, the storekeeper, didn't ask why. His hands shook as he gathered supplies, and he kept his eyes down like looking at Gideon might bring bad luck down on his own head. He placed the bag on the counter and leaned in, whispering so low I barely caught it. "The place," he murmured. You went out there." Gideon gave a slow nod, nothing more. The entire store stiffened. A woman holding fabric froze mid-fold. A man near the nails and tools suddenly found the floor fascinating. And then the back door swung open. A tall man stepped in like he owned the air. He wore a neat coat that didn't belong in a dusty town like ours. His hat brim was wide, and around the base of it ran a silver band that caught the sunlight and threw it back cold, like a blade showing itself for just a moment. His hands rested near his belt the way a man's hands do when they're used to trouble and comfortable with it. He smiled as if he'd walked into a friendly gathering. "Mr. Hale," he said, voice smooth. "We finally meet proper." Gideon turned slow, like a door on rusty hinges. He didn't look surprised. He looked annoyed, which is a different kind of fearless. The man introduced himself without hurry. Hollis Ketch. I'd heard the name before. Everybody had. Ketch wasn't the sheriff, but he had the kind of authority that doesn't need a badge. He handled disputes for men who preferred not to handle them in daylight. Ketch's gaze flicked to the bag of supplies, then back to Gideon. He reached into his coat and dropped a leather pouch onto the counter. It hit with a heavy thud, and even without opening it, you could hear the metal inside. $500, Ketch stack, conversational, like he was offering Gideon a drink. For a tract you paid 12 cents for. That's a tidy profit. The store went still enough that I could hear a fly somewhere near the window. Gideon stared at the pouch. 500 for rotten boards and thistles. Ketch's smile didn't change. Not for the boards, for your good sense. Gideon's eyes narrowed. Then say what you want. Ketch leaned forward just a little. Tonight you ride back into town. You leave the deed right here on this counter. You forget Crow's Gate exists. And if I don't? Gideon asked. Ketch's eyes stayed pleasant, but the warmth behind them died. Then you'll have a lonely sort of bad luck, he said. The kind that finds men out past the last fence line. Nobody in that store moved. Mr. Sloane's hands trembled so hard he dropped a jar. It smashed on the floor, preserves bleeding out in sticky red. No one bent to clean it. Not yet. Gideon didn't flinch at the threat. He didn't puff up either. He just looked at Ketch like he was measuring the man's weight and deciding whether it was worth carrying. Then Gideon pushed the pouch back across the counter. No, he said. Just one word, quiet and final. A few people sucked in their breath like they'd watched someone slap a rattlesnake. Ketch blinked once, as if he wasn't used to hearing that word. That's brave, Ketch said. It's tired, Gideon replied. I'm fresh out of running. For a moment I thought Gideon meant draw right there in the store. But he didn't. He only smiled again, this time without friendliness, and turned to leave. At the back door he paused and glanced over his shoulder. Whatever's out there with you, it's not yours to keep. Then he stepped out and was gone. The room exhaled in a dozen small sounds. Boots shifting, somebody swallowing, a floorboard creaking like it was relieved to be allowed to move again. Gideon picked up his supplies, paid without haggling, and walked out into the sunlight like he hadn't just refused the kind of money that changes a man's life. I was outside by then, close enough to see the dust on his sleeves and the tightness around his eyes.
Mr. Hale, I blurted, before my courage could change its mind. Gideon stopped and looked at me. Up close, he seemed even more worn, like sleep had become a thing he used to know. Folks say Crowsgate ain't normal, I said. He studied me a beat, then answered in a way that sounded almost gentle, if he didn't listen too hard. Normal don't grow in this country, son. He swung into the saddle, gathered the reins, and rode west again, back toward the cabin nobody wanted, toward the gate that had already taken one breath from the night. I stood there watching the dust trail behind him, and I realized something I hadn't understood the day before. Gideon hadn't gone into town like a man shopping for bandages. He'd gone like a man stocking up for a siege.
By the time Gideon Hale rode back to Crow's Gate, the sun was already sliding down behind the far hills, turning the prairie into long shadows and sharp edges. His horse moved like it didn't want to be there. Each step was careful, ears twitching, nostrils flaring, as if the air itself carried a warning. The gate came into view, weather gray, half swallowed by tall grass, and Gideon felt that same cold pinch in his chest. The rope he'd cut still hung from the crossbeam, frayed and limp. The dark stains on the wood hadn't faded. They looked like they'd soaked in and decided to stay. He pushed through the gate anyway. The cabin sat beyond it, hunched low like an animal trying not to be seen. Gideon dismounted, the supply sack heavy in his hand, and crossed the yard with a steady, tired purpose. When he opened the door, warm light met him, stove fire, low and carefully kept. And there she was. Nayeli was awake. She sat upright against the wall, blanket pulled around her shoulders. One large hand rested near the iron poker, as if she'd already made up her mind that anything could be a weapon if you held it like you meant it. Her face was bruised and dust-smeared, her lips split, a dark swelling rising under one eye. The bandage at her throat looked cleaner than before, but the skin beneath it was still angry and raw. Her eyes fixed on Gideon the moment he stepped in, sharp, wary, and proud, even while her body clearly ached. "You came back," she said, voice rough but steadier than it had been. Gideon set the supplies on the table and let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Didn't have the manners to leave you behind," he said. It was almost a joke, except his eyes didn't laugh. Nayeli watched him like she was weighing the truth of that. Gideon unpacked the sack with the quiet efficiency of a man used to patching wounds and fences with the same hands. Bandages, a brown bottle of antiseptic, clean cloth, food that could survive a day in a saddlebag. He knelt near her and began to rewrap the rope burn, careful not to pull too tight. She didn't flinch. Not because it didn't hurt, because it did, but because she refused to give pain the satisfaction. When he finished, Gideon sat back on his heels and finally said what had been gnawing at him since town. "A man came into the store today," he told her, silver band on his hat, offered me $500 to walk away from this place. Nayeli's gaze sharpened, and for the first time something like recognition flickered across her face. "Hollis Ketch," she said. "You know him?" "I know what he collects," she replied, and there was no exaggeration in her voice. Fear, missing people, silence. Gideon leaned back against the table leg, eyes narrowing towards the boarded window as if he could see through wood. "He told me what's out here isn't mine to keep." Nayeli's mouth tightened. "He is right in one way. I am not yours." She paused, then added, "But this cabin is not only wood. It is where their lie hides." Gideon studied her a moment, then asked quietly, "Why you?" Nayeli's hand clenched the blanket edge. "They took me near the river crossing," she said. "Men with badges that were not earned." She swallowed carefully, the bandage shifting with the motion. "They wanted my grandfather to sign paper, give them land." Gideon's jaw worked, and his eyes went cold. "They think ink makes theft clean." "They kept me here as a warning," Nayeli continued. "They wanted my people to see me hanging. They wanted town people to see too, so everyone would believe Crow's Gate kills anyone who steps close." Gideon stood and paced one slow step, the floorboards creaking beneath him. "Why this cabin?" he asked. "Why not a jail?" Nayeli's gaze drifted to the center of the room, to a section of floor that looked almost ordinary, almost. "Because a man lived here," she said. "Hartwell, a surveyor." That made Gideon stop.
A surveyor, he repeated. He made maps for the territory, she said. He found lines moved on paper, not on land. He found the same ground sold again and again. Her eyes hardened. He tried to speak, then he disappeared. Gideon knelt and ran his fingers over the floorboards where her eyes had landed. The wood was old, but one square section felt different. Tighter, cleaner the seams. Dark resin filled the cracks like someone had sealed it on purpose. He looked up at Nayeli. They think he hid something here. Nayeli nodded once. They believe proof is still under this floor. That is why Ketch offered money. That is why they hung me here. Outside, the wind rose and slipped through the gaps in the boards with a low moan. And under that wind, faint, almost polite, came another sound. Metal on metal. A buckle adjusting, a horseshoe shifting against stone. Something that didn't belong to the empty prairie. Gideon moved to the narrow slit in the boarded window and pried it open just enough to see. In the darkness near the trees, shapes moved. Horses, men. A low camp kept careful and quiet. No big fire, no laughter. Just watchful bodies and the patience of people who believe they own the night. Gideon closed the slit and turned back, his face set. Nayeli's voice was low. They are close. Gideon grabbed his Winchester and checked it with the calm of a man who'd already decided. Then we'll have company, he said. Nayeli studied him. You are not afraid? Gideon let out a tired breath, almost a sigh. I'm afraid of plenty, he admitted. I'm just more tired than I'm afraid. For a moment the cabin held them in a tense quiet. Firelight flickering, shadows crawling along cracked boards. Two strangers bound together by an ugly piece of land and the kind of trouble that doesn't knock twice. And while Gideon braced from what might come through that door, out beyond the gate, a thin boy on a borrowed mule, me, followed the dust trail west with my stomach tied in knots. I wasn't brave, not really, but I'd seen Gideon was use $500 like it was poison, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever waited at Crow's Gate was bigger than one man. The dirt road narrowed into sparse woods. The gate stood ahead like a crooked jaw. And even before I reached it, I saw the dark stain on the beam where the rope had been. That's when I understood the town hadn't been warning Gideon not to buy a cabin. They'd been warning him not to step into a story that was already hunting for its next body.
I reached the scrub line just as the last of the daylight was bleeding out of the sky. From there, Crow's Gate looked small and wrong, like a bad thought that wouldn't leave you alone. The cabin crouched in the grass with a thin ribbon of smoke drifting from the chimney, and the gate beam still carried that dark stain where the rope had been. I should have turned around. A sane boy would have turned around. But I'd seen Gideon Hale in the general store that morning, refusing $500 like it was cursed. I kept telling myself I was coming to warn him about Hollis Ketch. That sounded noble enough to repeat in my own head. Truth was, I was curious too, and curiosity out there gets dressed up as bravery real easy. So I stayed low behind a mesquite and watched. Inside the cabin, Gideon was already at the floor. I couldn't see every detail from where I hid, but later I'd hear how it happened, how the boards in the middle of the room looked just a little too tight, too neatly sealed with that black resin that smelled like old tar and patience. Nayeli sat up against the wall, blanket around her shoulders, watching Gideon like a hawk watches a snake. She was still bruised and bandaged, but the fire in her eyes had come back. She wasn't lying there waiting to be saved anymore. She was waiting to strike. Gideon scraped at the resin with his knife until his wrist ached, then pried at a nail that didn't want to give. When the board finally lifted, the cabin seemed to exhale. A cold draft rose from under the floor, damp, metallic, like earth that had been shut away. He held a lantern over the opening. Underneath was a shallow cavity lined with old canvas, like someone had built a hiding place in a hurry and then spent the rest of their time regretting they needed it at all. Gideon reached in and pulled out a leather portfolio wrapped in oilcloth. It was heavier than it looked. Dust spilled off it in a slow curtain. Nayeli's gaze sharpened, like she recognized the shape of trouble even before it was unwrapped. Gideon set it on the table and peeled the oilcloth back carefully, as if the thing might bite. Inside were papers, land plots, deeds, seals, signatures, the kind of paperwork men hide behind when they want theft to look like law. Even if Gideon couldn't read every line, he could read enough. Parcels sold twice, boundary lines shifted, names from town, official stamps that carried weight whether they deserved it or not. Nayeli's hand tightened on her blanket. She didn't say much, but her silence had teeth. Those papers weren't just ink to her. They were fences moved, rivers claimed, graves ignored. Gideon reached back into the hole and lifted out a small iron box, rusted at the corners and locked with a cheap latch. He cracked the lock with the butt of his knife. It popped open with a sound too loud for how careful the night felt.
Inside was a ledger, a stack of receipts, and a daguerreotype in a cracked case. Gideon opened the case, and the lantern light caught the old photo like a dark mirror. In it, a group of white men stood smiling beside survey stakes, as if they were posing with Cry's cattle. And half out of frame, almost like an afterthought, a line of native women and children sat on the ground with their hands bound. Nayeli made a sound that wasn't a word. Something in her face tightened, then went still. It wasn't weakness, it was memory sharpening into a blade. Gideon stared at the photo a moment too long, then closed it with a hard little snap, like he was shutting a coffin. The ledger was worse. Not because it was bloody, because it was neat. Names, amounts, payments, little lines that turned cruelty into accounting. Gideon flipped pages by lantern glow, and I swear the cabin felt colder with each one, as if the place resented being forced to remember. There were entries for deputies, for security riders, for relocation pressure, and one phrase that Gideon's jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack a tooth. Problem resolved at Crow's Gate. Nayeli's eyes stayed on the pages. They write our pain like store accounts, she said, and she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Gideon shut the ledger slowly. Ketch isn't the top, he muttered. Nayeli's stare didn't waver. No, she said. He is the knife, not the hand. Out in the brush, my stomach turned over. I could hear the cabin fire crackle softly, could hear the wind run through grass, could hear my own pulse. And then I heard something else, faint, close, unmistakable. Boots on porch boards. Not stomping, not rushing, just the careful, confident sound of men who didn't expect to be refused. Shadows moved near the porch. Horses shifted in the yard. A low murmur of voices, then quiet again, like they were listening for Gideon to make the first mistake. Inside, Gideon moved fast, but not frantic. He slid the papers back into oilcloth, shoved the portfolio into a grain sack, and pulled the sack tight like feed. He set it in the corner, half hidden in shadow, then turned back toward the door. Nayeli's eyes flicked to the center floor where the plank had been lifted. Gideon pushed the board back over the hole with his boot, trying to make the cabin look ordinary again, trying to make a lie convincing. That's when the knock came. Not a friendly knock, a testing knock, like someone tapping wood to see where it would split. The whole cabin went still. Even the stove's little flames seemed to hesitate. Gideon didn't speak. He just tightened his grip on the rifle. Nayeli sat straighter against the wall, shoulders square despite bruised ribs. Her hand drifted toward the iron poker again, and the look on her face wasn't fear. It was readiness. Outside, the porch boards creaked once more, someone shifting their weight, settling in, patient as a spider. I stayed frozen behind the mesquite, dirt under my fingernails, my mouth dry as old leather, realizing I'd come out here thinking I was stepping into a story. But I wasn't stepping into it. I was standing right at the edge of it, watching the next page turn, and knowing, deep in my bones, that whatever came through that door wouldn't be asking twice.
Ketch was on the porch before the night had even finished settling. I could feel it from my hiding place in the brush, the way the air went tight, the way the cabin's little glow suddenly looked too small for the darkness around it. A lantern's spill of light cut through the cracks near the door, and I saw boots on the boards. Then his voice came, smooth and patient, like he was calling on a neighbor instead of walking up to a kill. "Mr. Hale," Hollis Ketch said. "Evening. We can do this easy." Inside, Gideon didn't answer right away. The door opened only a hand's width, just enough for the barrel of his Winchester and a slice of his face. He kept the rifle steady, like he'd been born with it in his hands. "Easy left town," Gideon said. "What do you want?" Ketch leaned toward the gap like he wanted to smell the room. His silver hotband caught the thin light and flashed cold. Behind him, 2 riders waited in the yard, horses shifting and snorting under their weight. Ketch's eyes flicked past Gideon's shoulder and stuck on something inside. Later, I understood what he'd seen. The moved plank, the disturbed dust, the kind of little mistake a man makes when he's been digging up the truth in a hurry. "You've been busy," Ketch said, almost pleasantly. "I offered you money. I offered you a clean exit. You chose curiosity." Nayeli rose behind Gideon then, stepping into the firelight like a shadow deciding to become solid. Even wounded, she filled the doorway. Her blanket slid from one shoulder, and the bruises along her collarbone looked like storm clouds under skin. One of the men behind Ketch shifted in his saddle. His horse stepped sideways, nervous. Ketch's smile thinned. "Well now," he murmured. "You're harder to finish than I hoped." Nayeli's voice came out rough but steady. "You hang me like meat." Ketch tilted his head.
Hostages don't get to complain about presentation. Gideon's rifle didn't move. "Get off my porch." Ketch sighed, like a man disappointed by poor manners. "Let's not pretend 12 cents bought you rights out here. Hand over the papers and the little box. Let the girl come with us. You can ride back to town breathing." Gideon stared at him a beat, and the night felt like it paused to listen. "Funny thing about breathing," Gideon said. "It gets real expensive when a man thinks he owns it." Ketch's expression changed. Not angry, just colder. He took one step back from the porch, lifted his hand and made a small downward motion, like trimming a wick. "Burn it," he said. A torch arced out of the darkness and hit the roof with a soft, ugly thump. For half a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the dry straw caught and flame climbed fast, too fast, like it had been waiting years for permission. Gunfire cracked. Bullets punched through the cabin walls, splinters exploding into the air. Gideon slammed the door and shoved a heavy table against it. The legs scraped the floorboards, wood complaining under strain. Naeli grabbed the iron poker from near the stove, her big hand closing around it like she'd been holding that anger all day, just waiting for something to swing at. Smoke started to gather almost immediately. It crawled across the ceiling and sank down in the corners. The cabin filled with the sour bite of burning straw and gunpowder. Gideon fired through a narrow gap near the window, the Winchester bucking against his shoulder. Outside, one man dropped hard near the fence line, and the torchlight around him wobbled. Ketch's men weren't cautious anymore. They'd come to end it quick. Another kick hit the door, making the barricade jump. The latch began to splinter. Gideon dragged the green sack, where he'd hidden the papers, deeper into shadow, then crouched low with the rifle. He leaned close to Naeli for a second, voice tight. Whatever he said, it wasn't comfort. It was instruction. It was survival. Naeli's answer was in her eyes. She wasn't going with them. Not alive. Not ever again. The door finally burst inward with a crash that felt like the whole cabin's spine snapping. A man lunged through the smoke, rifle first, boots slipping on the dusty floor. Naeli swung. The iron poker hit his shoulder with a heavy, sick thud. He dropped to one knee, face twisting in shock, his rifle clattering onto the boards. Gideon fired at close range, the muzzle flash lighting his face for the briefest instant, hard, exhausted, determined. Outside, Ketch shouted, sharp and furious now. "Circle the pack, don't let them run." More embers fell from the roof. Burning straw drifted down in flakes, and hissed when it hit the damp spots Gideon had splashed along the wall. The air turned into a choking fog, smoke and flour dust together, stinging highs, turning lantern light into a dirty haze. From my hiding place, I watched the roof glow brighter and brighter. I watched men running, torches bobbing, horses stamping and pulling at their ties. I knew what I was seeing. Gideon and Naeli were going to die in there. And I didn't have a rifle. I didn't have a plan. I had a small knife I used for cutting hay twine and a head full of panic pretending to be courage. So I ran. Not away, toward the horses. I stayed low, darting through shadows and smoke. Heat from the burning roof washed over me like opening an oven door. A horse reared when it saw me, eyes wide and white. I whispered nonsense at it, anything, then grabbed the lead rope and slashed. The rope snapped. That horse bolted like the devil had bitten it. It tore past the men, and the sudden motion spooked the next horse, and then the next. In seconds, the yard turned into a mess of hooves and shouting, men grabbing at reins, torches swinging, orders getting lost under panic. A rider swung down and lunged toward me. I ducked under a horse's belly, dust and shadow filling my vision, my heart punching my ribs from the inside. I came out the other side and vanished back into the brush, lungs burning, hands shaking so hard I could barely keep my knife. Behind me, the attack had changed shape, not stopped. Ketch was too mean for that, but it had stumbled. The circle around the cabin loosened for a moment, and I saw Gideon use that moment like a man who'd been waiting his whole life for it. He fired again from inside, steady and deliberate, making every shot count. Naeli, coughing through smoke, held her ground with that iron poker like it was a war club. She looked less like a victim now, and more like a storm that had been insulted. But the roof kept crackling, timbers groaning under heat. The cabin was still burning, the bullets were still coming. Ketch's face, lit by flame, wasn't smiling anymore. He looked like a man whose easy plan had turned stubborn and expensive. And me, hiding in the dark again, realized something that made my stomach turn cold. I hadn't saved them. Not yet. I had only bought them a few breaths. And out on the empty flats beyond the fire and gun smoke, something else was moving toward Crow's Gate. something Ketch hadn't counted on.
The cabin was burning behind me, and the whole night smelled like pitch, gun smoke, and panic. From my hiding spot in the scrub, I could see the roofline lit up like a lantern somebody wanted the whole prairie to notice. Men shouted in the yard, horses screamed and pulled against their ties. Torches swung in frantic arcs, throwing crooked shadows across the grass. And inside that box of flame and splinters, Gideon and Nayeli were still fighting for every breath. I wasn't brave, not the clean kind. I was scared enough to feel it in my teeth. But fear has a funny way of turning into motion when you run out of choices. I crouched low, trying to make myself small, trying to think. That's when I heard it, beneath the gunfire and the crackle of the roof. A sound from far out across the flats. Low, deep, rolling, like thunder trapped in a horn. It wasn't coming from the cabin. It wasn't coming from the attackers. It came from the open country, and it made the hair on my arms lift, because I'd heard it once before, traveling with a trader caravan, an Apache call, a signal meant for people who knew how to listen. Hope hit me so hard it almost knocked me down, but hope doesn't do anything on its own. Somebody has to carry it to the right place. I looked back at the cabin, frames climbing, men circling, and I knew Gideon and Nayeli didn't have time for me to hesitate, so I ran. Not toward town, not toward safety. I ran away from the fire and into the dark, using the wash lines and low rocks like they were hiding places written into the land. My boots slid on gravel. Dust filled my throat. My lungs burned like I'd swallowed hot sand. Behind me, a shot snapped and hit dirt close enough that I felt grit spit against my ankle. I flinched, ducked instinctively, and kept running anyway. If I stopped, I'd be dead. If I slowed, Gideon and Nayeli would be dead. I followed the desert the way boys do when they grow up under too much sky, reading the shapes of the ground, choosing the shadowed path, trusting instinct more than sense. I aimed for the river crossing because that was where Nayeli said they'd taken her, and I figured if her people were searching, they'd search where the kidnapping started. The river wasn't much, just a narrow ribbon in a wide land, but under moonlight it looked like broken glass. Reeds whispered along the bank. The air smelled cooler there, damp and alive compared to the dry heat behind me. I stepped into the water, boots sinking into mud, ripples spreading in silver rings. I pushed through the reeds, one hand out, the other clenched into a fist just to keep myself from shaking. And then something cold stopped my breath. An arrowhead appeared in the darkness, right at my throat. So close I could see the dull metal and the faint scratches along it. So steady it felt like the arrow was part of the night itself. I froze, every muscle locked. I raised both hands slowly, palms open, trying not to move my neck even an inch. My heart slammed against my ribs, loud as a drum in my ears. Out of the reeds, shapes shifted. Men, Apache warriors, crouched low in the shadows, bows drawn, faces darkened for night. I could barely see their eyes, but I could feel them, the way you feel a storm before it arrives. One of them stepped forward, older than the rest. His posture was calm, not hurried. His hair was tied back with rawhide, and his eyes reflected moonlight like wet stone. He looked at me like I was a question. "Speak," he said in accented English. My mouth was so dry I almost couldn't. "Nayeli, Crow's Gate. They hung her. She's alive. Gideon Hale cut her down. Men are burning the cabin now. They're trying to take papers hidden under the floor." The arrow didn't move at first. Then the older man's gaze shifted, just slightly, toward the distant glow on the horizon. He said something in Apache, quick, sharp words, and the air around me changed, not softer, just decided. The arrow lowered a few inches, not gone, just lowered enough that I could breathe again. The older man studied me one more time. "You come?" he asked, like he was asking whether I wanted to walk into a fire on purpose.
Everything in me wanted to say no. Everything. My legs were shaking, my hands were numb. But my eyes kept seeing the cabin roof glowing, and I remembered Gideon's face in the general store, tired, stubborn, refusing to run. I thought of Nayeli hanging at the gate and still being alive enough to whisper danger. I swallowed and nodded. Yes. That seemed to satisfy him. He gave a short command, and the warriors moved as one body, silent, efficient. Horses emerged from cover, dark shapes breathing steam. Levy straps tightened, reins gathered, weapons checked with quick hands that didn't waste motion. They mounted without noise, like they'd practiced it their whole lives, and then somebody guided me to my mule, small beside those horses, and I climbed on with clumsy urgency, fingers slipping on damp leather before I got my grip. We rode. The prairie opened in front of us, cold and wide. The Apache riders formed a loose line, then tightened as the glow grew larger. Hoofs struck the ground in a steady rhythm, not frantic, not wild, purposeful. Dust rose low behind us, mixing with the faint haze of smoke drifting on the wind. As we crested a rise, Crow's Gate came into full view. The cabin was a bright wound in the night, flame licking upward. Shadows moved in the yard like ants around a burning crumb. Torches bobbed, horses broke loose and ran, scattering men who cursed and stumbled in the dark. The older Apache man's posture hardened. I felt it in the way the whole line of riders changed. Reins shortened, bodies lowered in the saddle, the calm before a strike. I gripped my reins so tight my hands ached, my stomach twisted. I wasn't a warrior. I wasn't sure I belonged there. But I'd brought them. And as the riders began to surge toward the fire, I understood something I didn't have words for at the time. The night wasn't just ending a siege. It was turning the whole shape of Crow's Gate inside out.
The night at Crow's Gate didn't end the way Hollis Catch planned. Inside the cabin, the air had turned into a choking stew of smoke and flour dust. The roof crackled like it wanted to come down in one angry piece. Gideon's lungs burned, his eyes watered, and every breath tasted like bitter straw. He could hear men outside, boots scraping, horses snorting, voices snapping orders, like wolves arguing over who gets the first bite. Then something changed. At first, it was just a sound, half swallowed by the wind, a low horn note rolling across the flats, deep enough to shake the ribs. It didn't belong to Ketch's men. It didn't belong to the cabin. It belonged to the open country. Nayeli heard it too. Even through pain and smoke, her head lifted, her eyes sharpened like a blade pulled from its sheath. Outside, the tree line moved. Apache riders appeared out of the dark in a wave, silent at first, then suddenly loud with hooves and war cries that split the night wide open. Their horses didn't hesitate at firelight. They surged into the clearing like a storm that had finally found a door. Ketch's men turned towards them too late. The confident ring around the cabin broke apart, not in one clean moment, but in a handful of ugly, panicked choices. One hired gun tried to swing his rifle up and couldn't find a steady target. Another kicked his horse to run and got tangled in the chaos of loose animals. Torches wobbled and fell. The yard, which had been a trap, became a mess of smoke, fear, and shifting shadows. An arrow flew through the torchlight and struck a man's arm. His torch dropped into the dirt with a hiss, and the flame died down under kicked dust. The dark swallowed him and left him scrambling. On the porch, Gideon forced the cabin door open and stepped out into the heat and noise, Winchester shouldered, face streaked with soot. For a second, the fire behind him made him look like a man walking out of a furnace. Nayeli came with him. She didn't move like a wounded hostage anymore. She moved like someone who had survived being turned into a warning and decided to become one instead. Even bandaged, even bruised, she stood tall beside Gideon in the burning light, her silhouette throwing a long shadow across the porch boards. Some of Ketch's men actually flinched, not because she held a gun, because she was supposed to be hanging at that gate, because the image of her alive didn't fit the story they'd been paid to believe. Apache riders pressed inward, tightening the clearing into a ring of horses and steel. Their movement wasn't frantic, it was disciplined, practiced.
They weren't just charging, they were closing a circle. Nayeli lifted her voice in Apache. Her throat bandage shifted with the effort, but the words carried. The riders answered her call with a unified shout that made the hired men's courage leak out of them in a hurry. That's when Ketch made his move. He didn't scream, he didn't panic the way his men did. He scanned the yard like a gambler reading a table, looking for the one path that wasn't blocked by fire or horses. Then he yanked his reins and tried to cut through the mess before the circle closed. Gideon tracked him through the smoke. He raised the Winchester, steady as stone, and fired. The shot didn't drop Ketch, but it came close enough to turn the escape into a flinch. Ketch ducked low in the saddle, cursed, and drove his horse harder. He vanished into scrub with a couple men behind him, fast but not clean. He ran like a man who'd just learned he could bleed. The rest of his hired gang didn't have that option. Apache riders surged, and the yard filled with the hard sounds of a fight ending, hooves drumming, men shouting, bodies hitting dirt, weapons clattering. It wasn't glorious, it was messy, desperate, and final in the way frontier violence always is. Then, as quickly as it had exploded, the battle began to settle. Horses were calmed, wounded were checked. Smoke rolled upward into the stars. The cabin roof still burned in patches, but hands moved with buckets and wet hides, beating back flame before it could finish the job. In the middle of all that, an older Apache man dismounted near the porch. He didn't rush. He didn't look around like he was lost in the chaos. His eyes went straight to Nayeli. She saw him, and something in her face cracked. Not weakness, not surrender. Relief. The kind that hurts. "Grandfather," she said, voice rough, barely holding. He stepped close and lifted 2 fingers to her cheek in a gesture so gentle it didn't belong to the night's violence. He spoke softly in Apache. Nayeli answered, and for a moment the burning cabin and scattered bodies didn't matter. The world narrowed down to a granddaughter standing alive in front of the man who'd feared he'd never see her again. Gideon stood back on the porch, rifle still in hand, suddenly unsure where to put himself. He wasn't part of their blood, their language, their history. He was just the man who'd cut the rope. But the elder looked at him eventually. "You were the one who cut her down," he said in slow English. "Yes." "And you found what was hidden," the elder added, gaze shifting to the cabin as if he could see through boards. Gideon hesitated, then went inside and brought out the grain sack, heavy with oilcloth and paper. He carried it like it might explode if he dropped it. 2 warriors stepped forward to take it with careful hands, not because they feared paper, but because they feared what paper could summon. They unwrapped the bundle under lantern light. Old deeds, seals, ledgers, names that meant power in nearby towns. Proof of stolen land disguised as law. Proof that men in clean collars had done their violence with ink first and bullets only when ink wasn't enough. The elder's face tightened as he saw it. Nayeli stood beside the documents, her hand hovering over them without touching. Her anger was quiet, but it filled the space like smoke. I arrived on my mule then, coming up the slope behind the riders, and I nearly forgot to breathe when I saw it. Nayeli standing on the porch, alive. Gideon still upright. The cabin still there, burned but refusing to fall. Gideon glanced at me like he couldn't decide whether to scold him or thank me. He chose neither. He just looked tired, in the deepest sense of the word. The elder spoke again, voice low. "They will return," he said, "not only with men like Ketch, with uniforms, with papers, with law that has been thought." Gideon rubbed sweat off his brow and stared at the dark where Ketch had disappeared. "And if they come back before these papers reach the right hands?" he asked. The elder's answer was simple. "Then Crow's Gate becomes your grave." There was a plan forming in the quiet that followed. A fort to the east, a federal marshal who wasn't paid by the same men who'd paid Ketch. A chance, then as a thread, but real. Gideon looked at Nayeli. Nayeli looked back. No big speeches, no promises spoken for the whole prairie to hear. Just a shared understanding between 2 people who'd already been marked by the same place. The smoke drifted up. The wind kept moving the grass. And Crow's Gate, once a gallows, was now surrounded by riders who had come to take one thing back from the night. Not revenge. Evidence.
We didn't leave at dawn. We left before it, when the world is still mostly night and every sound carries too far. Crow's Gate was behind us, scorched and smoking, the kind of place you could feel even when you weren't looking at it. Gideon moved like a man who decided sleep was a luxury for other people. He stropped the oilcloth bundle tight to his saddle, so tight it looked like he was trying to cinch the truth down so it couldn't escape. Nayeli rode a bigger horse than the one Gideon had brought, borrowed from her people. She sat stiff-backed, one hand near the saddle horn, the other loose at her side. You could tell every hoofbeat jarred her ribs, but she refused to show it. She had that pride a wounded animal gets, no weakness, not where enemies might smell it. I rode my mule, which is a polite way of saying I hung on and hoped the mule didn't decide today was the day it quit its job. 2 Apache scouts rode ahead, quiet as shadows. Another stayed back for a while, watching our trail the way a man watches a door he knows is going to open. Before we went, Nayeli's elder, her grandfather, pulled Gideon aside. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the look on the old man's face.
It wasn't a threat made for drama, it was a simple fact. If Gideon betrayed her, he'd be found. Out here, promises like that weren't poetry, they were geography. Gideon nodded once, like he understood the same language. Then we rode east. As the first light came up, the land turned harsh in a hurry. Morning out there doesn't arrive gently, it climbs fast, and by midday the sun feels like it's leaning on your shoulders. Naily kept scanning ridgelines, not just looking forward, but looking through the land, like she knew where danger liked to hide. Gideon did the same, only he looked tired while he did it, the way a man looks when he's been counting bullets in his head since childhood. By midday we reached a narrow cut between rocks, the kind of place sound echoes and mistakes get trapped. The scouts stopped. One lifted a hand, and the whole group froze. Tracks. Fresh hoofprints in sandy soil, sharp edges, not softened by wind. Too many of them, town riders. And among them one set that dragged slightly, as if the horse favored a leg. Gideon stared at that drag mark like it was a signature. He'd seen it before. They follow, Naily said quietly. My mouth went dry. How many? The scout held up fingers, then shifted his hand again to count more. Enough. Too many for a clean fight. Gideon looked around, reading the land the way my uncle read a horse's eyes. Low rocks, dry brush, a wash cutting away like a scar through the earth. He muttered, almost to himself, should have taken Ketch's money. I blurted, you didn't even take it when you had the chance. He glanced at me, and for half a second there was something like humor in his eyes. That's what makes it regret, son. Naily's mouth twitched like she almost smiled, then she tightened again, because this wasn't the sort of situation that pays for laughter. We pushed into rougher ground, where horses had to pick their steps, and the land forced the pace down. By late afternoon we spotted an abandoned mining camp ahead. Collapsed shocks, a rustic boiler, and a well with a broken windlass that leaned like a tired man. It was the kind of place that looked empty until you remember empty places still keep memories. We dismounted in the shade of a leaning structure. Gideon checked the well. He leaned in, sniffed once, and pulled back like he'd been slapped. Bad water, rotten. I drifted toward one shock and peered inside, and my stomach lurched. Bones. Not a whole body, not something neat enough to understand. Just scattered remains and scraps, the kind of mess coyotes make after men run out of luck. I stumbled back. There's bones. Gideon looked in, eyes flat. Coyote leftovers, he said, or worse. Naily didn't look at the bones long. She looked at the doorway, at the frame, at the wood. Scratch marks, tool marks, panic marks, cut into the boards like someone had tried to carve their way out. People hid here, she said, and somebody found them, getting injured. We didn't stay. As the sun began to drop, the air changed. That quiet pressure came back, and then we heard it. Distant hoofbeats, faint but steady, like a clock ticking down. They're closer, Gideon said, and there was no complaint in his voice, just fact. He angled us into a winding wash where steep banks could hide us. We dismounted, led the horses by the reins, moving slow and careful. Hoofs scraped stone softly. Dust clung to sweat. My mule snorted like it wanted to file a formal protest. Then shadows appeared above us on the rim. Riders. 6, maybe more. Silhouettes moving along the edge, scanning the wash below. One of them held a bent silver hotband like a trophy, and the sight made my stomach twist. We pressed ourselves against the wash wall, breathing shallow. My heart felt loud enough to get us killed. Naily reached down, picked up a stone, and threw it hard into brush farther down the wash. The crack sounded sharp in the stillness. The riders turned towards it, horses shifting. Gideon didn't waste the moment. He guided us backward deeper into shadow, leading the horses with steady hands, moving like a man stealing his own life back. It worked, barely. When full dark came, we rode again, pushing harder than the animals liked. Foam gathered on bridles, my legs went numb, my throat felt like sandpaper. Near midnight we reached a stretch of badlands with hoodoo rocks, tall twisted columns that looked like figures standing watch. Under moonlight the place felt haunted, and I hated that my mind went there, because ghosts don't carry rifles, men do. We made camp in a shallow notch, no fire, no comfort. Cold food, water rationed in small sips that barely counted as mercy. Gideon slept in short bursts with his Winchester across his chest, waking at every shift of wind. Naily didn't sleep at all. She sat upright, staring into the dark like she was daring it to move. I finally whispered, do you ever get tired? She looked at me, and her eyes didn't soften, but they didn't harden either. Yes, she said. Then, after a pause, like she decided to tell the truth anyway, I get tired of men. I didn't know what to say to that, so I stayed quiet and listened to the horses breathing and the wind sliding through stone. Above us, the stars looked sharp and crowded, and I realized the land didn't care who was right or wrong. It only cares who could last. And somewhere out beyond those hoodoo shadows, the riders following our tracks were still coming, patient as hunger.
We reached Fort Vance with the sun already high and mean, the kind of heat that makes the whole world shimmer like it's trying to disappear. From a distance, the fort looked solid. Low adobe walls, a flag snapping in the wind, soldiers moving around like ants that had learned to march. Up close, it felt less like safety and more like another kind of waiting room. A sentry stepped out as soon as we came within shouting range. Rifle up, shoulders tight, eyes flicking from Gideon to me and then locking on Naily like he couldn't decide what he was looking at. She sat her horse stiff-backed, bruised, throat bandaged, and still somehow taller than the moment itself. The soldier's hands tightened on his rifle stock, but Gideon raised an open palm and kept his voice calm. "We need the federal marshal," Gideon said, "and we need him now." That got us inside. Not warmly, not kindly, but the gate opened, and that was enough. Fort Vance wasn't the heroic kind of place you read about in dime novels. It smelled like sweat, leather, and tired men. We were led into a small office where Marshal Silas Rook sat behind a desk that looked like it had survived arguments, paperwork, and maybe a fist or two. Rook had a worn mustache and eyes that looked like they'd seen too many official explanations. Gideon set the oilcloth-wrapped bundle on the desk. No speeches, no flourish, just a heavy thump that made the lamp flame tremble. Rook unwrapped it slowly, like he expected the papers to bite. He flipped through the deeds and plots first, then the ledger. I couldn't read much, not at my age, not with my education being mostly horses and chores, but I didn't need to read to understand what was happening. Rook's face changed the longer he looked. His jaw tightened, his breathing got shallow. Finally, he leaned back and muttered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer trying to become a curse. "This," he said, topping the ledger without letting his finger linger, "is going to make someone try to kill all of us." Gideon didn't argue. They already started. Rook's gaze shifted to Nayeli, and for the first time he seemed to really see her injuries. The bandage at her throat, the bruises along her face, the way she held herself like pain was a visitor she refused to entertain. When she told him, in her rough English, they'd hung her at a gate to force her people to sign away land, Rook's eyes went flat with anger. He didn't waste time after that. He went to the telegraph and started tapping out messages, measured, fast, the way a man writes when he knows the words might not arrive in time. He called deputies, he sent orders to bring in a judge quietly before the judge could smell the trap and run. He spoke in short sentences and moved like the whole territory had suddenly become smaller and more dangerous. At some point he noticed me standing near the door, hot in my hands like it could protect me. "And who in hell are you?" he asked. I swallowed. "Tomas," I said. I brought riders. I ran for help." Rook stared at me, then looked at Gideon like he wanted an explanation. Gideon answered without looking my way. "He's the reason we're not Ash back at Crow's Gate." Rook let out a dry breath, almost a laugh, but not friendly. "Lord help me," he muttered, "the frontier's being saved by children and fools." Gideon's mouth twitched. "Then it's in good hands." By the next morning we were riding back west with Rook's men. The dust rose behind the horses in a long pale ribbon, and the wind cut across the plains like it was trying to sand the skin off our faces. Nobody talked much. It wasn't the kind of ride that welcomes conversation. When Crow's Gate finally appeared ahead, the place looked like it remembered everything. The cabin still stood, blackened and patched, smoke stains clinging to the roof beams like old bruises. The gate waited in the same spot, its crossbeams still scarred. 2 crows sat on top of it, quiet and watchful, heads tilted as if they were judging us. And beneath the gate, hammered into the dirt, was a stake with a strip of pale cloth tied to it, fluttering in the breeze like a small flag of insult. It wasn't just a message, it was a dare. Nayeli stared at that cloth and her face tightened. Not fear, something older, memory. Rook's deputies spread out, rifles held with discipline, scanning the tree line. The prairie stayed still, too still. Then a voice drifted from the woods, close enough to be heard, far enough to stay safe. "Marshal," the voice called, smooth as oil. "Did you bring my property back?" Even before I saw him, I knew it was Ketch. Rook raised his voice, calling out charges. Conspiracy, kidnapping, attempted murder. Words that sounded sturdy in an office and thin out on open ground. The woods didn't care about words. A shot cracked. The bullet hit the crossbeam of the gate, right where the rope had hung Nayeli. Splinters jumped. The crows startled, but didn't fly yet. It was deliberate, like Ketch was signing his name into the wood. Nayeli flinched for half a heartbeat, then steadied herself like she'd grabbed her own spine with both hands. Gideon stepped forward before anyone could stop him. Slow, calm, rifle held low. The kind of walk a man takes when he's done begging the world to be fair. "Ketch," Gideon called. "You want something? Talk to me." Ketch stepped out from behind a cottonwood, alone, no hat now, hair neat anyway like vanity could stop a bullet. He held a revolver low, casual, but his posture was coiled, ready. They faced each other near the gate, dust curling around their boots. For a moment everything went quiet enough that I heard my mule breathe behind me. Ketch lifted his revolver, fast. Gideon fired first. The Winchester cracked, loud and final. Ketch's shot went wide and tore more wood from the gate. Ketch stumbled, hand clamping his side, trying to back into the trees like he could melt into them. He didn't get the chance. Nayeli moved, too fast for someone that injured. She crossed the space in long strides and caught Ketch's wrist before he could raise the gun again. Her grip tightened. The revolver dropped into the dirt. Ketch looked up at her, and for the first time his face didn't hold that easy smile. "So," he rasped, "the dead girl walks." Nayeli leaned close, eyes cold as night water. "I did not die," she said. "You failed." Rook's deputies rushed in and slapped irons on Ketch. He cursed, spat blood, tried to turn it into a performance, but handcuffs have a way of shortening a man's ego. Gideon lowered his rifle slowly, hands shaking now that the moment had passed. The crows finally took off, wings beating hard against the pale sky. Years later, when I was older and the story had settled into the kind of thing people repeat by firelight, I rode past Crow's Gate again. The cabin still stood, quieter now. The gate was still there too, but it wasn't used for a rope anymore. Someone had nailed a simple wooden board to the crossbeam, plain, unpainted. One word burned into it, the kind of word you don't argue with out there. Still.